I want to introduce our speaker, and you may have already heard of. If you haven't, you certainly will talk about this night going forward. Justin Brierley is our guest tonight. He comes to us from Surrey, England, which is just outside of London, where he is married to Lucy. She's a minister in the church there. They have 4 children, the oldest of which, Noah, who is here with us, traveling with his dad. Welcome, Noah. We're glad you're here. Of course, we're glad Justin's here. Justin's a much sought-after speaker. He is a radio host, a podcast host. He's experienced great experience in print media and magazines and editing, all sorts of different work in the Christian ministry circles. His first book that I have come into contact with, how many books are there? 47, 48? The 2, okay, good. Well, the first one was, let me see if I can remember the title, Why After Speaking with Atheists for 10 Years, I'm Still a Christian. That book did very well. If you haven't read it, you should. But I have a question for Justin, just to be sure, because that book came out 6 or 7 years ago. You've talked to many more atheists since. Are you still a Christian? Good. Glad to know. Okay. We can continue. We'll go on. We're glad you're here, Justin. Would you help me welcome Justin Brierley to the Lanier Theological Library?
Well, good evening, and thank you so much for the warm welcome we've received since arriving here at the Lanier Foundation. I felt as we drove into the complex that I was turning into a little corner of England somehow, complete with the rain as well, which was amazing. So it feels like we're coming home in some ways, but it's what a wonderful place you have here, and what a privilege to be able to share some time with you this evening, speaking on a book that I've only very recently published, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. I'll tell you a little bit about my background as the talk progresses, but I want to begin with a quote that I actually use at the introduction of this book. It's from a well-known poem called Dover Beach, written by Matthew Arnold, a Victorian poet. And it has this well-known stanza within it that runs like this: "The sea of faith was once too at the full, and round earth's shore lay like the folds of a bright girdle furled, but now I only hear its melancholy, long withdrawing roar." Now, in Matthew Arnold's day, in the Victorian era, that melancholy, long withdrawing roar stood for the way in which science and technology and secularism had started to pervade Western culture. And he saw this sea of faith retreating in its wake. In many ways, that picture has only accelerated in the last 150 years as we look at our very, very post-Christian Western culture, especially in the UK, where I live. We're witnessing the decline of church-going, more and more people describing themselves as non-religious. And of course, here in the USA, you're not far behind in those trends, especially when it comes to younger generations. And in many ways, many people, especially the new atheists, who again we'll come to speak of in a moment, essentially saw Matthew Arnold's picture of the long withdrawing roar of the sea of faith as signaling the end of Christianity, that ultimately there would be a terminal decline. But I had a thought about this, a sort of a revelation really, a few years ago, when I was hosting a conversation with a well-known character in the UK, Douglas Murray. Douglas Murray and I were actually contemporaries at Oxford University, though he's gone on to much bigger and more impressive things than I have. He's now associate editor of The Spectator magazine, a well-known cultural commentator in the UK. And I brought him on for a conversation with someone who's actually, I think, spoken here before, N.T. Wright, about living in a post-Christian culture. And Murray himself is an interesting character because he's not a believer, but he does describe himself as a Christian atheist. That sounds like a contradiction in terms, doesn't it? But what he means by that is he doesn't see atheism per se as really giving us any positive ethic for life, morality, virtue. He sees that all of the things he does value in his Western upbringing and culture really did come from Christendom. And that's why he calls himself a Christian atheist. He acknowledges that all his moral instincts, essentially, were formed by the Christian story. And during our conversation, he happened to mention that some of his friends, serious intellectual people, had converted to Christianity in recent years. And he said this, he said, the thing about that sea of faith that Matthew Arnold said was going out was that, well, it could come back in again. After all, that is the point of tides. And that made me think, perhaps Douglas Murray is onto something. Perhaps the sea of faith could come back in. In fact, I had seen some similarly interesting stories of adult converts to Christianity. And Douglas Murray himself represented something of a breath of fresh air when it came to the conversation on God and faith. Because in many ways, Douglas Murray stood in stark contrast to some of his other intellectual peers in the secular world. This is where I'd like to introduce you, if you haven't already been introduced to them, to the New Atheists. On the screen there you can see the so-called Four Horsemen of New Atheism. This was a movement that really began in the mid-2000s. It was a very dogmatic, very anti-theistic version of atheism that was very popular in culture for a good while. In the UK, we had something called the Atheist Bus Campaign in 2009, which saw London buses emblazoned with the slogan, "There's probably no God, now stop worrying and enjoy your life." As I say, this was a movement that was, in a sense, quite evangelistic when it came to its message. Here in the US, there was the Reason Rally in 2012. In Washington, D.C., tens of thousands of skeptics and agnostics rallied to champion science and reason. And this was the movement. It was very in your face. It was very dogmatic. It was quite combative. This movement reaped a number of converts to its cause as well along the way. It was seen as a threat to the Christian faith by many people. And my show that I began hosting in the mid-2000s, The Unbelievable Show, really began in that milieu of new atheism and its claims against God, that God was an irrational belief, that religion was bad for you. And we enjoyed hosting some really barnstorming debates between some of these new atheist characters and the Christian thinkers. And I enjoyed being in the middle of those kinds of conversations. But I did notice something happening over the years that I was hosting these shows. Increasingly in more recent years, those shows between dogmatic atheists and Christian thinkers started to be replaced by shows with secular thinkers who were less dogmatic in their atheism. People who were more open to the value of Christianity. In fact, I started to realize that more atheists were coming on my show who defined themselves against the new atheism than for it, saying, I'm not a Richard Dawkins type of atheist. Richard Dawkins was in many ways the preeminent figure of this movement. He was a best-selling biologist in the UK, but became the head really of this movement through his own best-selling atheist work, The God Delusion. And so while we had a number of conversations on those issues, I did notice that the movement started to peter out, partly because we were starting to see a new wave of intellectual thinkers coming on the scene who were not necessarily Christian, but they certainly weren't anti-Christian either. I will talk about the gentleman on the right of that picture a little later on, Jordan Peterson, quite a well-known Canadian psychology professor. I brought him on my show about 4 or 5 years ago to have a conversation with Susan Blackmore, an atheist psychology professor from the UK. They were debating, can we make sense of life without God? Now, Jordan Peterson, not a Christian, but to all intents and purposes, taking the Christian line in that show. Something was happening in the culture. New atheism, in fact, was starting to crumble, and I watched with interest from the sidelines. My first book, Unbelievable, Why After 10 Years of Talking with Atheists I'm Still a Christian, was really looking at the phenomenon of new atheism and giving Christians tools and resources to help to answer some of those big objections that they raised. But my new book, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, begins by telling the story of the rise and fall of new atheism. Because ultimately, new atheism ran out of steam. As much as it had a lot of exposure and a lot of people following it in the mid-2000s, by the mid-2010s, I would say it was a shadow of its former self. What had happened was that the movement essentially got overtaken by the culture wars, I would say. There were a number of people within the movement who started to question why it was being run by essentially a phalanx of old white men. They wanted to see more diversity, more commitment to various social justice issues. In fact, a particular part of the movement decided to label itself Atheism Plus. So not simply atheism, but also a commitment to issues around feminism or LGBT rights and so on. But there was another part of the movement that reacted strongly against this. They didn't want to have their movement infected by what they saw as politically correct ideologies. They were only interested in science and reason. And so the movement started to experience these internal conversations and controversies. In fact, eventually even Richard Dawkins himself was stripped of his Humanist of the Year award in 2021. Why? Because of his views on transgender. As I say, the culture wars really came to dominate the new atheism. They found that once they'd agreed that God didn't exist and religion was bad for you, they really couldn't agree on much else. And that was the problem. In tearing down God, this movement had failed to erect anything in God's place. And people need something to live for. They can't simply exist on the basis of a negative argument. They need some ethic, some positive thing around which they can structure their life. And in my view, New Atheism simply did not offer that. And that's why I believe we've seen something approaching a rebirth of belief in God. Now, as I've said, the statistics certainly don't bear this out. When I put the title of this new book on my social media, a lot of my atheist friends immediately responded saying, "What rebirth of belief in God? Haven't you seen the statistics, Justin? We live in a post-Christian culture, and the statistics are only going in one direction." And I would agree with them. On the surface, that is what the picture looks like. But I think sometimes we need to be looking at what's happening upstream as well, because very often that will determine what happens later on. And I was seeing a change in the atmosphere around the way Christianity was being spoken of and debated. I was increasingly finding that actually there was a new openness among the secular intellectuals I was bringing into my studio. People like Douglas Murray, who were asking, well, can we live without something like the Christian story in our post-Christian West? What kind of story are we going to invest our lives in? Some of these thinkers are very concerned at the turn in our culture towards various ideologies that are all essentially competing with each other. In the absence of the Christian narrative, which once gave people that sense of common structure to their lives, a sense of who they were and what part they played in this big story, suddenly without that story, all kinds of other quasi-religious stories have taken its place. Issues around gender and identity and sexuality on the progressive left, sometimes political mythologies that people replace God with on the right. Whatever it was, these stories, if you like, were proving that religion hadn't really gone away. It had just taken on different forms in a post-Christian culture. And it's so interesting now to see the way in which those new atheists are no longer talking about institutional religion. You would struggle to find Richard Dawkins or Sam Harris or Daniel Dennett, writing op-eds any longer on the dangers of religion. They're all talking about woke ideologies or these quasi-religions that have, in a sense, come to replace Christianity in our culture. And that's so interesting to me because it means that the ground has changed. Sometimes we can find ourselves, if we call ourselves a Christian, if we're part of the church, responding to the arguments of yesterday when in fact there are new questions being asked today. And that's what I hope this book does, help us to address the questions being asked today and where our culture finds itself. I'm excited, despite the statistics that we're all familiar with, I'm excited by the possibilities of this new transformation, this new breath of fresh air that I find in the culture when it comes to the God question. The reason for this is that I think as we've seen some of these new thinkers come into view, and I'll share some of their stories along the way, I think we're experiencing the fact that as these stories we're telling ourselves in our culture fail to deliver, as they start to run out of steam, I see in various tantalizing ways a new openness to the Christian story again, to people being open to the idea that possibly that still has some value, something to say to our culture. And I'd like to give you 3 areas where I think we're actually seeing the God question being raised in our culture by not simply Christian thinkers, but by some of these secular intellectuals as well. Some of these secular intellectuals have really big platforms, a lot of influence, and I'm excited to see the way in which they are opening the door to the Christian faith for many people. The first area where I see a really interesting conversation going on is in the question of human existence. This takes us into more scientific territory, but when I began my Unbelievable show several years ago, we started to debate science and faith, but particularly this idea that the new atheists had come up with, that essentially science had replaced the need for God, that the more we know about the universe, the less reason we have to believe in God. But as I invited Christian thinkers on to debate these issues, I realized there really is an alternative story to tell here. In fact, if anything, I see the progress of science and the more we know about life and the universe opening up rather than closing down the God question. I'm sure next month John Lennox will be able to talk about this in far more detail than I. But I was excited, for instance, by the fact that many of the people I brought on were talking about a phenomena such as the fine-tuning of the universe for life. If you're not aware of this, it's the extraordinary fact that our best physics tells us that the universe, when it came into being, which is itself a rather remarkable thing, but that it was birthed with a set of fundamental laws and physical constants that seem to be incredibly finely tuned to allow life to develop at some point in our cosmos. It's a sort of a complex idea, so a few years ago I put together a short video to explain this concept. So just for a few minutes I'm going to let the video do the talking, and then I'll tell you about some of the interesting people who are talking about this from a secular perspective as well.
Some people say that human existence is a result of a roll of the cosmic dice. Like the gambler who stakes his life savings on the next throw, we just got lucky in the lottery of life. Some people say there's no purpose in the universe, no grand plan, no God behind it all. Our numbers just came up and here we are. But I don't believe them, and nor should you. If I roll this dice, the chances of getting a 6 is 1 in 6. That's not too bad. But what are the chances of me rolling 6 twice in a row? Well, the odds get longer. It's 1 in 6 times by 1 in 6. That's 1 in 36. So I'd have to be pretty lucky to get 2 6s in a row. Now, every time I add the chances of rolling another 6 in a row, the odds go up exponentially, and it gets even more unlikely. Now, what if I rolled this dice 70 times, and every single time I got a 6? Okay, that's pretty unlikely, but it's possible, right? Well, in fact, the chances of rolling a 6 70 times in a row are around 1 in 10 to the 55. That's a 1 with 55 zeros after it. Now, just to put that in perspective, how long would I have to stand here rolling this dice, allowing about 5 seconds per roll, before hitting that lucky streak and rolling 76s in a row? Well, I had a mathematician friend work it out for me. On average, you would have to continually roll this dice for 100 trillion, 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 trillion years before your numbers come up. That's a long time. What if you applied that thinking to us? What are the odds of us being here? Now, the odds of rolling 76s in a row, 1 in 10 to the 55, as it happens, those are the same odds of something called the expansion rate of the universe being just right for the existence of us here today. From the moment of the Big Bang, when our universe began to rapidly expand, the rate of that expansion was exquisitely finely balanced. Any faster, and the universe would have expanded too rapidly to allow the formation of chemicals, atoms, stars, and galaxies. Any slower, and the universe would have collapsed back in on itself. But as it happens, the universe expanded at just the right rate to allow for life to develop in the future, for us to be here. It hit 70 rolls of the number 6 in a row, first time. And the expansion rate of the universe is just one among 30 or so other incredibly sensitively finely tuned constants and fundamental forces in the universe that must be just the way they are for the universe to be able to produce us. So let's imagine, if I went ahead and rolled this dice 70 times, and what do you know, every time it came up 6. No waiting for trillions upon trillions of years, first time. Beginner's luck? Hardly. You would assume that I must have rigged it. Maybe the dice are loaded. Maybe there are 6s on every side. It can't be chance. Now let me ask you, why would we assume that this universe with us in it, which is actually way more improbable than my 70 rolls, is just a result of chance? The fact that we're here shows that someone's loaded the dice. In fact, maybe there's no dice at all. What if the evidence points to this life-permitting universe actually being the product of an intelligent mind which intended for us to be here? Now, you could come up with some speculative other theory. Maybe there's an infinite number of universes, giving you an infinite number of chances to roll the dice. Maybe. But we don't have any scientific evidence for it. So if you're hanging your hat on that possibility, then you're every bit as much committed to a faith position as the person who says God was behind it. Believing in God isn't a delusion. It's a perfectly reasonable conclusion when we look at the fingerprints on our universe. And if it's true that we aren't just the fluke result of a cosmic roll of the dice, and that we're actually here because a grand designer intended us from the very beginning, well, that's worth staking something on.
So it's an interesting phenomenon, but not one that simply Christians are talking about. Let me introduce you to one of the secular thinkers in the scientific arena who are making all kinds of interesting observations about the nature of our universe and the fact that we're here in it to make sense of it. Paul Davies is a physicist who runs the Origin Center at Arizona State University. He, in a way, has for a long time been rather a thorn in the side of the new atheists and the scientists represented there, because he simply will not accept a sort of simplistic, reductionist, materialist understanding of our universe. Now, he wouldn't call himself a person of faith, religious, and yet he says when he looks at the universe and sees a phenomenon like the fine-tuning of the universe for life, or sees the fact that life itself got going, something that is extraordinarily unique and unusual in terms of what it took for that to happen, he sees something else going on. In fact, when I last spoke to him, he said this. He said, the directionality in the universe, going from matter to life to consciousness, and he said, I would add comprehension to that. He said there's an arrow of time in the direction of comprehension. And if that is the case, if this is not just an enormous fluke, a happy series of accidents, then that to me comes very close to something like a meaning or purpose in nature. I think that's a sort of religious feeling, what Einstein called a cosmic religious feeling. Now, I would be tempted to reach for a Greek word that probably many of you are familiar with to describe what Paul Davies calls there, this directionality in the universe. Logos. It's this idea of speaking order into chaos, a principle of life and logic. And it is, of course, the word used to describe Jesus Christ in the Gospel of John, speaking life into the cosmos. I think it's exciting when you find someone like Paul Davies pointing out just all the ways in which what we know about the universe and the nature of life within it, and our ability to comprehend that existence, that there's something rather like the Logos, Christ, spoken of in the New Testament happening. That interaction between the scientific world and the revelation of Scripture, I find very exciting. I find that there's a new conversation going on, if you're willing to see it, in academia, in the sciences, around these issues. The fact that we're here, I think, is actually rather good evidence that there's a mind behind the universe. I find there to be far more evidence. The picture fits far better with a Christian worldview than the atheistic worldview, that we're really here by chance. I just don't see that the evidence actually supports that. The second area where I think we're seeing a really interesting new conversation develop is human value. I believe God makes sense of human value in a way that the new atheist picture simply cannot. Why do we believe, for instance, in the idea of human rights, human value, human dignity? Why do we believe that there are some very real rules about why we should and shouldn't treat people in certain ways? Is it simply down to science and reason? Is it just a sort of social contract that we've managed to develop over time? I don't think so. I've never really heard, actually, in all the years I've been hosting conversations, a satisfactory answer from atheists on this question of human value. why we treat people in certain ways as having intrinsic value and dignity. In fact, there was a conversation I had with Richard Dawkins several years ago where this really came out. He was having a debate at Oxford University with John Lennox. John Lennox, I'm sure, will remember this. And they had a fantastic conversation on science and faith. And I had the privilege afterwards of going to the after-show party and having my very first chance to interview Richard Dawkins, the architect of this new atheist movement. I was rather nervous, obviously, but we had the most fascinating conversation when it came to the issue of morality, human value. And I want to just read you exactly how that conversation went. I said to him, but Richard, if we'd evolved into a society where rape was considered fine, would that mean that rape is fine? And he answered, well, I don't want to answer that question. It's enough for me to say that we live in a society where it's not considered fine. We live in a society where selfishness, failure to pay your debts is regarded askance. That is the society in which we live. I'm very glad that's a value judgment. Glad that I live in such a society. I said, but when you make a value judgment, don't you yourself immediately step outside of this evolutionary process and say, well, the reason that this is good is that it's good, but there's no way to stand on that statement. And he said, well, my value judgment itself could come from my evolutionary past. And I said, well, therefore, it's just as random in a sense as any product of evolution. He said, you could say that, but in any case, nothing about it makes it more probable that there's anything supernatural. And I said, okay, but ultimately, your belief that rape is wrong is as arbitrary as the fact we've developed 5 fingers rather than 6. And he said, you could say that, yes. And I think you could say that, and actually I think you should say that if you're a thoroughgoing naturalist atheist like Richard Dawkins is. But why do we all recoil with horror at the idea that our belief that rape is wrong is simply the happenstance of the hand that evolution and culture happen to have dealt us in this time and place? It could have been different. We could have had a different view on that. Actually, most of us feel instinctively that there are really right and wrong ways to treat other humans, regardless of what the general opinion on it is at any moment in time. And in my view, there's only really been one good explanation for that. I've heard explanations, these socio-cultural evolutionary explanations, but none of them really get to the heart of the matter. Why do we believe that we should treat people with value, dignity, intrinsic moral worth? I believe it's there on the first page of Scripture. It says humans are made in God's image. If that's true, then everyone has infinite worth, infinite value. It makes sense of this idea of why we invest people with that dignity, value, why we create documents of human rights. But this isn't just being pointed out by Christian thinkers. Again, there's a fascinating number of secular thinkers who are coming to very similar conclusions. I want to tell you about Tom Holland, who's someone I've had the opportunity to interview several times over the last couple of years. He has a fascinating story because he is a well-known historian in the UK. He co-hosts one of the most popular history podcasts in the world, The Rest is History. But he has a fascinating story of how his own childhood faith sort of sputtered out by his teenage years. And as he embarked on a career writing about the ancient world, he really regarded himself as just another secular liberal, assuming that all the rights and values that he held so important were simply what any civilized culture would come up with. But it was as he researched the world of the ancient Greeks and the Romans that he started to change his mind, because he realized how very alien their way of thinking was to his. This was a world where slavery was simply an unquestionable part of the economy, where certain people could be treated as sexual property, where the lives of women and children were cheap, where the slaughter and enslavement of 1 million of your enemies was a cause for triumph for Caesar. And he realized that his own beliefs in human dignity, equality, compassion, freedom, they didn't come from the Greeks and the Romans. And they didn't seem to come from science and reason either. In fact, he swiftly realized where they did come from. The Christian Revolution, Jesus Christ. It was that moment, that movement, that downstream had created who he was, his moral instincts about the way we should treat each other. And he went on to say to me in an interview, look, I'm not sure I believe the Christian story, Justin, but in almost every way, I am a Christian. And he's been reminding his secular peers about this, pointing out to his humanist brethren that actually they really owe their values to the Christian story. I find it intriguing that people like Tom Holland, whose book Dominion tells this in much greater detail. I highly recommend it, and if you ever get a chance to bring him to the Lanier Theological Library, you really should do, Mark. I find the fact that people like Tom Holland are reconsidering the value of Christianity and asking especially where our culture is going in the absence of that story rather refreshing. Someone I've met more recently, Louise Perry, has a rather similar story. Louise, again, grew up with a sort of a natural assumption and inclination towards atheism, sort of being a liberal Westerner. She was schooled in classical feminism, really, growing up. But it was her experience working in a rape crisis centre that made her start to reconsider the way she approached sex and relationships in particular. She realised that actually the sexual revolution wasn't working for women. She went on to write a book called The Case Against the Sexual Revolution. Not as a Christian, she simply detailed all the socio-evolutionary ways in which actually the Christian view of marriage, of monogamous, faithful marriage, was probably the best way we've ever come up with for helping people to control and channel their sexual desires. She came to very pro-Christian conclusions in this book, despite never having believed it herself. Now, what I find interesting in the conversations I've had with Louise Perry and Tom Holland is that all of this has started to open up the Christian story in new ways to them. They're finding themselves rather intrigued, attracted by that story. But perhaps more importantly, the people that they're speaking to, the many people who are listening to their stories through their podcasts, through their platforms, are themselves being opened up to the idea that perhaps, just perhaps, the new atheists were too quick to dismiss God. Maybe there's something about this Christian story that we still need to take seriously. Human value, that's one of the areas where I think God has made a comeback. I think there's good reason to believe that if we do believe that we all have this inherent value, dignity, there are certain ways we should and shouldn't treat each other. That relationships and sex are actually, there's something rather sacred about it, as Louise Perry's come to realize. Perhaps it points to something beyond ourselves, that we're not simply material creatures living in a purposeless universe. Finally, I believe God makes sense of human purpose, and again, this is an area where I see the dialogue between Christianity and atheism, again, coming to obviously very different conclusions on this. On an atheist worldview, in a sense, there is no ultimate purpose to life. We can make perhaps our own small meaning and purposes, but in the end, all of our longings, dreams, and hopes will be extinguished in the heat death of the universe, when the universe finally runs out of usable energy, and everything here throughout history will be a long-forgotten dream, just extinguished in a cold, sterile void. Now, that is the story of reality that atheism paints a picture of, but it's not a story that anyone really finds helpful when it comes to living a meaningful life. What I find is that across all cultures, times, and space, there has been this search for something more, for a bigger picture, for purpose, for hope, for meaning. And I find that actually, because the new atheists failed to deliver this sense of meaning and purpose to people, people started to look for it in other areas. And I'm intrigued by the fact that some of these new secular thinkers have really cottoned on to that. They're scratching that itch. They've understood that people need more than simply science and reason to make sense of life. People like the aforementioned Jordan Peterson. Now, Peterson is a somewhat controversial character. He has strong political opinions, which he's not afraid to share on social media. But what I find fascinating about Peterson is the way he's attracted a very young crowd, especially of young men, looking for meaning and purpose. These, I believe, are the same people who were turning up for the new atheists 10 or 15 years ago, but they didn't find the answers they were looking for. And Peterson takes their search for meaning very seriously. And what's so interesting to me is that when he speaks to them in packed-out auditoriums, in fact, Noah and myself, my son, are going to be seeing him at the O2 Arena. That seats about 30 or 40,000 people in London next month. What's fascinating about that is that when he speaks to them, where does he point them to in their search for meaning? He's pointing them to Scripture. He's pointing them back towards the Bible. He's saying this ancient wisdom, which the new atheists disparaged, actually, this is what has given people their purpose and meaning in life for millennia. Where he is on his own faith journey is a separate question in a way. There's been a lot of ink spilt on just whether Jordan Peterson himself believes in God. I asked him this question myself when he came on my show, and he said, well, it depends what you mean by God. And he said, intriguingly, his answer was, I live my life as though God exists, which he sees as more important than simply believing in God. And he may be onto something there. But what I find fascinating with Peterson is that he does seem to be approaching something like the Christian faith, because in a recent interview he had with a friend of his who's an Eastern Orthodox Christian thinker, Jonathan Peugeot, he talked about having this sense that actually, when it comes to the realm of myth and imagination and meaning, which he's obviously invested in as a psychologist and a scholar, he described how he had begun to understand that the objective world of history and fact met that world of myth and meaning in a person, in Jesus Christ. It's very similar to the journey C.S. Lewis went on when he started to put those two worlds together and found that Jesus Christ was the bridge. And I just wonder where Peterson will end up. But in that conversation, he said of Jesus Christ, I'm amazed at my own belief and I don't understand it. Well, I think he's perhaps working out his faith in public, and we'll be interested to see where it goes. But for now, what I'm most interested in is the fact that scholars like Jordan Peterson, thinkers, intellectuals who aren't necessarily Christians themselves, are nevertheless opening this door to people. I know so many people who've been influenced by Peterson in particular to investigate Christianity. I could tell you about Dean, a friend of mine in Australia who, was a card-carrying atheist for many years, who simply assumed that Dawkins and Harris had got it right until he started listening to Jordan Peterson, and suddenly the possibility that Christianity might make sense came alive. He now is attending church. He's still very much a sort of questioning agnostic at this point, but he's been put on the path to asking better questions. The good news is, for you, for me, and for Jordan Peterson, is that search for meaning and purpose, I believe, does have something that answers it. I believe that the deepest longings of our hearts are ultimately answered not simply in a philosophy or a psychological analysis, but in a person, Jesus Christ. And the wonder of Christianity is that not only can it inspire these intellectuals to consider how the world has been shaped by the Christian story and the psychological depths it gives us as a way to understand life, but the fact that beyond that, it's actually true. It's not just a useful fiction. These are events, people, times and places that really happened. I want to finish with the story of someone I've only met this past year, Molly Worthen. I met her too late to include her in the book, but I wish I could have, because she has a fascinating story herself. Molly Worthen is a noted historian of North American religion, and for the past 20 years or so has been based at the University of North Carolina, teaching there. She's also a journalist, writing for outlets such as the New York Times and the Atlantic. Molly has been an agnostic most of her life, until last year, when she was baptized into the Christian church. So what changed for Molly? You see, on the surface, she should have every reason to reject the Christian faith. She has seen the good, the bad, and the ugly of the politicization of the church, of the bad behavior of Christian leaders. And yet, she became a Christian. The reason for this was that a pastor that she was doing a profile piece on challenged her to get off the agnostic fence. He said, Molly, you've been interviewing and looking at religion all of your adult working life. Have you ever really looked into the claims of Jesus Christ himself? And she had to admit she hadn't. That sent her on a journey. Now, because she's quite well connected, it meant she could check in with some pretty heavyweight thinkers. She ended up in an email correspondence with Tim Keller, a well-known recently passed away Christian thinker based in New York. She also got into an email correspondence with N.T. Wright, a well-known historian of the New Testament. And they were both able to help answer some of her questions around the historicity of Jesus and the events of the New Testament. Molly knew all of the arguments against Christianity, but she ended up being convinced that something undeniably miraculous had happened 2,000 years ago, and that the best evidence we have seemed to point in the direction of what those earliest Christians claimed, that Jesus of Nazareth, someone who had claimed to be God's Messiah, had been crucified and had been raised from death in vindication of that claim that he was Lord. There was, if you like, a resurrection-shaped hole at the center of the birth of the Christian church. I believe that Molly Worthen and all of us can come to know that there is actually a real object, a person who meets that search for truth, meaning, beauty, love. And I believe there's so many people in our world crying out for that meaning, looking for it, turning up for the Jordan Petersons of this world to see if they have the answers. I think they're asking the right questions, but I don't believe Jordan Peterson has all the answers. But there is a story that does. It's a story that I believe people may just be beginning ready to hear about again, to take seriously. Because once you've run out of steam on all those other stories, sometimes you're forced to go back to the story that underlies them all. In that sense, I believe, going back to Matthew Arnold's poem, that sea of faith, we may just be beginning to see the tide turn. It's certainly gone a long way out in the West. But who knows, perhaps some of these stories about these intellectuals who are opening up the Christian story again for their audience, some of these surprising converts like Molly and many others that I speak of in my book, perhaps they are the bellwether, the first fruits of something happening. Perhaps we're living between the tides. Perhaps God is not finished in the West. I hope and pray that that's true. I'm excited to see increasing numbers of stories. I start meeting people like Molly Worthen, and suddenly I seem to meet them everywhere I go. People who have been surprised to find that in their search, as they tried to make sense of their story, they've been surprised to find that Jesus was waiting for them on the shore. And my hope and prayer is that many more will come back in with that returning tide of faith. The question for us is, will we be ready to greet them and help them to make sense of things? I pray that we will. God bless you, and thank you for listening.
How do we deal with the God that's created in the minds of people that is more than their their wishful thinking?
Well, if I understand the question correctly, it's what do we do about the fact that God may be conceived as just a sort of projection of our hopes, if you like, wishful thinking. It's interesting, I've just been reading on the plane on the way over here, a book that's just become very popular in the UK by David Baddiel. He's a comedian, a well-known comedian in the UK. He's an atheist, he's a secular Jew. And he's written a book called The God Desire. And it's a book about why he, even as an atheist, feels this intense desire, wishes that God did exist. But interestingly, he makes this argument in the book, it's the very fact he has this desire for God that makes him believe that it's not true, that actually it's a sort of projection, if you like. And I think maybe a lot of people have that concern. Maybe the fact we kind of want there to be more, we want there to be something that explains life, maybe that's just us kind of wishing for a sort of celestial father figure or something. But I think C.S. Lewis has a wonderful response to this. He was a champion of something sometimes called the argument from desire. And he said, well, look, a duckling wants to swim. Well, there is such a thing as water. A baby feels hunger. Well, there is such a thing as food. People feel sexual desire. Well, there is such a thing as sex. And he said, if I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, then perhaps the only explanation is that I was made for another world. And I think that's true. If all of our other desires seem to be met by something, and yet across all time, space, and culture, everyone has this instinctive idea that there must be more, and a lot of people are searching for that in the form of God, well, what if there's something that actually meets that desire as well? So my argument to David Baddiel would be, I think your desire is actually evidence for God rather than against God. I think it makes sense to see that we're created with this kind of desire because there's something that actually meets it. So I don't buy this idea that, it's all just projection. I think that there are good reasons why we would have that desire in us in the first place.
Next question. Do you communicate with theologians and philosophers in France?
Do I communicate with theologians and philosophers in France? I've got to be honest, not very often. I do have some listeners in France, and I'm friends with them. But more often than not, it's English speakers who are... I would, if you are interested in the story of at least one French thinker, I can highly recommend a new book. It's by Guillaume Bignon, and it's the story of how he became a Christian after many years as an atheist. And he's got an absolutely fascinating story. The name of the book is escaping me just now, but it's a wonderful book, and he's a great Christian thinker. So Guillaume Bignon is one.
That's an unusual name, escaping me.
No, the book is not called Escape.
Oh, sorry. The name of the book is Escaping Me. I wasn't sure. Okay. I was just teasing. I'm sorry.
Very good.
Welcome to this side of the pond. Have you followed up with the Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox sources that you interviewed after the Russian invasion of Ukraine?
Oh, so this is someone who obviously saw one or two of the shows I did in the wake of the Ukraine war beginning last year. I have been able to talk to one or two of the people I interviewed. I've had a personal interest in keeping up with some of the Christians who have been involved. Our own church actually has been involved in helping a number of Christians from Ukraine find homes in the UK as they've fled the war. So yes, the short answer is I have been able to. It was a fascinating interview. It's still there if you want to go and listen to it. It was essentially a British journalist and an Orthodox thinker from Ukraine talking about sort of Putin's motivations, not just political, but actually religious, kind of quasi-religious motivations in beginning the war, and it's well worth a listen.
What got into your head to start Unbelievable?
So the Unbelievable show brought, for the 17 plus years that I was hosting it, Christians and non-Christians together for dialogue and debate. And I really began it without really knowing anything about apologetics or theology. It was, in a way, I learned it all as I went along over those years. But the real reason that I began hosting these conversations between Christians and non-Christians was because I felt like we needed to model what good conversations looked like. It's easy, in some ways, to live in a Christian bubble, but becoming more and more difficult to do that, actually, in our technological age. And I just felt that the time had come for the church to sort of get outside that bubble and start to look at what those conversations would look like, and it's been wonderful to be able to do that.
Have you experienced efforts to cancel you or your programs?
I'm glad to say that I don't think I've really experienced that personally. I am aware of sort of, where cancel culture can be problematic. The show itself, in a sense, was somewhat shielded from that by the fact that the Unbelievable show that I hosted for many years was always bringing two perspectives into dialogue. And so in a sense, it always had that sense of balance, that even if we were doing a controversial issue with a controversial voice, there was usually someone opposite that person. And so it felt a bit harder to cancel when there was 2 points of view.
This writer says, I believe that our psychological upbringing carries a lot of weight in our decisions, including believing and accepting God, because the consequences that decision brings with it. What do you think?
I think there's truth in that. Of course, the reasons we come to believe in God are varied, and they will include personal, emotional, psychological reasons. I'm not denying in any sense that those are important motivations for people. What I do believe, though, is that whatever may exist in that realm, there's also a sort of an objective realm where we can look at evidence. So, for instance, what science is telling us about the nature of our universe and whether it feels like there does need to be something beyond the universe to explain it. The historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ. These are things which I think we can all look at, whether we, whatever our psychological motivations, and simply ask, well, what's the best explanation for these facts? And I think that there is, in a sense, an objective argument for the truth of the Christian faith. Of course, in the end, we cannot ignore the psychological aspect of our personality. And I've met many people who I think at one level simply don't want Christianity to be true for psychological reasons, and therefore there's almost no amount of evidence you could present them to make them think it's true. On the flip side, there are people who I think probably really would like this to be true, and so once you remove some of the intellectual barriers, they want to walk down that road. In the end, ultimately, there's going to be a lot of factors going into why we believe. I'm happy to leave it to God to understand the full motivations of every heart.
Yeah, I might add to that, nothing in contradiction, but maybe something further elucidating. People often will say to me, well, you believe because you grew up in a Christian home and your mom taught you and dad taught you, and that's the way you are. So that's why you believe there's a God, to which I say that may be true in some ways. By the same token, people who don't believe in God often don't believe in God for the same reasons. They got brought up in a home with the same psychological stuff. That doesn't make it true or not true. That just may be the road that I walked or the road that you walked. But which road's the right road? And that's where looking at the objective evidence comes into play.
It's sometimes called the genetic fallacy, suggesting that if you came to a belief for some non-rational reason, therefore the belief is false. Well, no, that doesn't show the belief is false. It could be true, even if you believed it for purely psychological reasons. The question is there good evidence for that belief? And if there is, you should consider it.
And that's the hardest part because of confirmation bias. We all tend to only listen to arguments and accept evidence that confirms what we already believe rather than challenges it. And that's a chore with it.
Absolutely. We need to try and do our best to be open to other people's perspectives, but yeah.
How do we, the church, best receive refugees from materialism who are in a crisis of meaning?
That's a great question, and one I actually address in some detail in the final chapter of this new book. The meaning crisis is a term coined by certain psychologists who recognize that we're living in a culture where people feel almost alienated from themselves because they don't have a sort of big picture, a story to live into, and so we're grasping for all these smaller stories to make sense of life, but they're not working. And I think we are seeing the effects of that in the mental health crisis, for instance, especially among younger people. I think a lot of that is generated not just by social media and technology, but by the fact that they don't have a story to make sense of their life. And for me, I think we are going to see refugees from this meaning crisis. And the question is, I think we need to be a church, if we call ourselves a church, that is ready to accept and understand and love people who are pretty messed up, actually, people who are going to be hurting, people who have all kinds of questions and doubts. And the way I put it in the book is I think we need to be a capacious community that counters cancel culture. So forgive.
Can we?
Well, you can hardly say it, let alone be it, can you? I mean, the point is the church should be the place where people find the kind of grace that they're looking for, where they find that meaning that they're looking for, where messed up people can come and find grace and forgiveness. It's increasingly hard to find that in our culture, I believe. And so the church has to be the place where we model this, where we transcend the culture wars and say, actually, you can come here and you can come with all your faults and mistakes because we're all in the same boat when it comes to that. And I believe it's only in community that we can actually hope to tell a better story about what life's about. So my hope is, with all our own faults and failings as a church, and there are many, we can still be the kind of people who welcome people back who are looking for that meaning.
I think there's a real mental shift for us between saying, here's what we believe Christianity teaches and here's how we do it, and if you want to be one of us, get your act together and you can come do it with us, as opposed to, we believe that Jesus is the Messiah and that his Spirit will grow you, but if you're messed up and all sorted and worried and lost, come on in. We welcome you, we will love you, and watch Jesus change you after you've come in, not to get in the door.
Yeah, I agree. And it's a challenge, but it's always been that way. The Christian church, from its inception, has been a strange, weird thing where people who should have been marginalized and on the outside were welcomed in, and they transformed the world. So my hope is that we haven't lost that essential spirit of Christ, which engages our world in that.
Which brings the next question: what is the biggest barrier to faith in the Western world as you see it? Or what questions cause doubt for you?
I mean, the biggest barrier, I could speak to intellectual questions people have, but I often think that those are sometimes the window dressing. They're not always the real reason that that people. I think we live in a culture that is saturated by a different story. It's the material story of reality, that you are ultimately a cog in a machine. You're part of a sort of a mindless process, if you like, and you basically have to make your own way in the world, make your own meaning. And that has saturated our academic life, it's saturated popular culture in many ways, and it's leading to, as I say, this meaning crisis. And I think in a sense that's the underlying background hum which we're dealing with when it comes to why people are rejecting the Christian story. So I think it's about helping people to look at, understand, imaginatively grasp a different story of reality, that there is actually, the world is not disenchanted, that there is this Christian story that undergirds everything. And of course there's a time for giving people those apologetic arguments, good arguments for God and the historicity of Jesus and so on. But I like the way that Voltaire put it. Not Voltaire, I apologize, Blaise Pascal. Blaise Pascal said, make religion attractive, make good men wish that it were true, and then show them that it is. And I think that's our job as Christians. Make them wish that this story were true, show them why it could make sense of their lives, and then go and show them why it actually is true. What was the second question, Mark? What was the...
Is your biggest struggle?
My biggest struggle? If I'm honest, I think my biggest struggle has been seeing people fall away from faith. I think that's really tough. Someone who appeared to have really understood and been part of the Christian church. And I can't judge the motivations and the heart of people who do that, but that's always been a challenge, personal challenge to me. And I've had lots of conversations with people in that position, ex-Christians and so on. Now, the good news is I've also seen people come full circle. People who have deconstructed have actually reconstructed as well. So it's not that that's always the end of the story. But I do find that a personal challenge.
I can't read this next question without first noting that in law school, one of the things you're taught very early is if someone asks a question like, have you quit beating your wife? It's objectionable in a courtroom because it assumes a fact that's not in evidence, namely that you were beating your wife at some point. So you can't answer it yes, and you can't answer it no, because if you weren't beating your wife to start with, there's no real way to answer the question. And I say this with due respect because of this question.
Okay. I stand prepared.
And I will explain, if you don't, why I consider this question maybe not worded as well as it might have been. Do you favor only, I'm not sure if that word is favor, but it'll work. Do you favor only on Christianity, or is your God big enough to have 1,000 paths to the top of the mountain?
I see what you mean about there being a bit of a background assumption to the question. I think it is a bit of a false dichotomy that's being painted there. Either it's this narrow, one-way God, or this bigger, more expansive God with many paths through different faiths, I suppose. For me, I'm a Christian. I do believe that when Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life, he meant it, that there is a way, a unique way to God made known through Jesus Christ. That may sound on the surface of it like it is very narrow, fundamentalist, but actually I don't believe it is, because in the end, even the person who says, well, all paths can lead to God, that's still a truth claim. That's still an exclusive claim you're making to know the way in which God works. There's that old parable about 3 blind men, and each is sort of feeling something, and one person says, oh, I feel this and I feel that, and they're all describing different parts of an elephant. And it's often used as a sort of a metaphor for the fact we're all just, as people of faith, experiencing God in different ways, but ultimately it's one big elephant. The problem is with that parable is that, well, there's still an observer who can see the whole elephant, okay? There's still obviously someone who does have the full picture. So simply saying, well, I'm much more humble because I think that all paths lead to God. Well, no, you've got an exclusive truth claim yourself there, and you need to... So I don't... In the sense, we're all making truth claims, okay? Why do I believe that actually Jesus is the way to the Father? I think because there was an event that happened in history where this person, Jesus, lived, said the most extraordinary things that still shape our world today, died claiming that he was the Son of God, and then rose again in vindication of that fact. If that's true, then I believe we found the key that opens the door. Does that exclude all other religions? Actually, I would say, in a sense, it makes you open to seeing where you can the truth in other religions. They don't have the whole truth, but at least I'm not an atheist would have to deny there's any truth in any religion. I can see the way in which some of my Muslim friends, they've got something there. We've got a common belief in a creator God. But I do believe that we most perfectly understand who that God is in the person of Jesus Christ. And I don't think that's an arrogant thing to claim. It's only arrogant if it's not true, in a sense. And I do believe it's true.
Yeah, and I don't mean to judge this question harshly, whoever wrote this, because my only concern is I believe that the Christian story is true, but I think that makes God huge, not narrow. And the fact that there are truths that you can find in all religions is because God has hardwired all of us to find the path to him. But I think incumbent upon us is to try to find which is, I've got a daughter in Los Angeles and I've got a daughter in Florida. And I can drive to both of them on I-10. But if I want to go to the one in California, I can't get on I-45. All roads don't go there. And I've got to make rational decisions. And I don't think that makes God small. I think that may be an area of truth. All right, how do you think Christians can remain humble and take challenges seriously if, as you suggest, we see a rebirth?
How can we take challenges seriously? Well, I think we have to do it by being genuinely open. That was really what I was trying to do with the Unbelievable show, was to create a space where people could ask those questions. The problem sometimes as Christians is that we feel we have to constantly deliver bulletproof arguments and responses to people's objections. But I think Christian confidence comes in being able to simply listen to people, to hear their objections, and not have a sort of fight or flight response where we have to immediately shout them down or duck the conversation. I think actually confidence comes in being confident enough in our own story to allow people to tell us why they don't believe, okay? And actually I think people respect you a lot more if you hear their questions and actually give them the space to talk about them. And yes, there will become a time when it's important to give an answer to, as 1 Peter 3:15 says, give a reason for the hope that we have. But we have to do it with that gentleness and respect. People won't, the answers won't land if they're not delivered in a way where people feel like they're genuinely being understood, respected, and listened to.
And I think that's part of being authentic anyway. We should care for each person and where they are. Okay, I don't know if it was your little video on the dice in Vegas that has influenced me or not, but we are almost out of time and we've got 6 questions.
Oh.
So pick a card, any card.
Okay. I'll go for this one. Here we go. Oh, I got it. Okay. Well, it's funny you mention that. Is evolution as random as a roll of the dice? There's obviously some divine hand at play here. I mean, it's a good question, and I don't want to suggest that, in a sense, evolution is purely random in that sense, because obviously those who posit evolution as the way in which life developed on Earth are talking about a system that happened, mutual genetic mutation, but acted upon by natural selection, so sort of selection of the fittest and so on. Now, you could say that's not a random process, and I would agree, but it's not a directed process. It doesn't have an ultimate aim or outcome that is kind of prescriptive in a sense. So when I say in that instance, which I assume you're referring to, where I had that conversation with Richard Dawkins, are our moral values, as random as whether we developed 5 or 6 fingers. I don't mean that evolution itself is a sort of random process by the way in which it works, but what I do mean is that there's no sort of, it could have been that evolution decided to give us 6 fingers rather than 5, because that was a useful thing in our culture, in our society. But it's not so there's no kind of predetermined outcome in that sense. And likewise, I think the question that gives us then in terms of morality is, well, is morality just another sort of outcome of evolution? Is it just the thing we happen to have developed as a way of kind of propagating our DNA, if you like? And it's just a sort of a useful fiction, in a sense. There's no real moral values or duties in the world. It's just the things that help us get on. And in a sense, those who disregard that, the Putins of this world, who decide, well, I'm not going to act in accordance with these moral values, are they actually doing anything other than just acting against their evolutionary instincts? Well, for me, that's not enough. The way that we actually think about morality is that it has this dimension where it forces itself upon us. Morality is about what we should do, not just what we happen to have been dealt by an evolutionary process. And if that's true, then it has to be something more than evolution. There must be, for such a moral law to exist, as Lewis said, there must be a moral lawgiver. So for me, I'm happy, if someone wants to give me a sort of an evolutionary explanation for morality, that's all well and good. The question is, why should I abide by it? Okay, that may be how I got these, society got these ideas, but it still doesn't tell me why I should follow it. And for me, that's the important bit of morality. And the question, and I don't see any way to get to that idea that we should follow this moral law unless there's something beyond us, our opinions, and evolution that guides it.
Would you join me in saying thank you to Justin?